But thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, An Introduction to Artscaping, Developing Arts in Nature Experiences in School. And this really is the launch of two publications. Firstly, a guide to establishing arts in nature opportunities in your school, and then the research findings from the Branching Out project, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I just wanted to say very quickly, the webinars are from the learning from the Branching Out research project, which was undertaken with the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, along with Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination. You can see our Twitter handles there, so please do tag us if you are tweeting about the event today, but also in conjunction with Anglia Ruskin University, Full Scope, Cambridge Acorn project as well. And the project was funded by the UKRI, so UK Research Institute, and as well as the school project funded by Full Scope, and support for CCI reports were funded by Public Health. So we'll have a short bit of introduction in a moment, an overview of the research by me, and then it'll be very much a panel discussion. If you have any questions at any point, please do put them in the Q&A function. You can see there's a chat function, but also a Q&A function. If the question is for someone specific, then please do let us know, and we'll pick that up later on towards the latter half of the event. But before we proceed any further, and I will introduce colleagues who are on the panel very soon, we'd like to, as I say, start by acknowledging that this is World Mental Health Day. And so we'd like to start with something child and joy focused. And to do that, I'd like to invite Ruth to read the Artscaping Manifesto, which was written by children at Mayfield Primary School. And as she does that, what I'm going to do is share, and hopefully you can see this, a fantastical map, and it's this Alfie Carpenter's map of Bramfield Fields as the backdrop. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth.
Thanks, Nicola. Thanks. As Nicola said, we wanted to bring the children's words right in at the beginning here, and their wisdom and fantastical kind of knowledge that they brought to this. When we invited them, they came and joined us for a day as artists in residence at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Education, and we talked to them about, we asked them what they thought they would like as a manifesto for artscaping, and these were their words, and we've shared them widely, and we share them now with you. A manifesto for artscaping. Be free, imagine anything, have fun. Know anyone can do it. There are no wrong answers. Share and talk. Don't rush. Try things out and experiment. Make a mess. See that art is everywhere. Keep trying. Move around. Be comfortable. Be brave and trust.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And hopefully we can hold those in our minds as we think moving forward about not only the practice, but the impacts of that practice. So I'm going to stop sharing now so you can see us all. And we're going to move on to talk a little bit about ourselves, just so that you know who we are. And I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves, to say who they are, but also what their connection is to CCI and also the Branching Out programme, which we're going to talk a little bit more about throughout this session. So as Ruth, you started it by reading that lovely manifesto. If I come to you first, if that's okay.
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, I am Ruth. That said, I'm the director of Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination. I've been part of the group that we founded ourselves as a group back in the early 2000s and became a charity in 2007. We were motivated then by what we felt was a sort of drying out of children's lives and a shared passion for what we felt was the sort of transformative potential for arts experiences and having your creativity fully supported. So we felt back in 2007 nervous about the sort of direction of travel for children's lives, and I think we've been working at the coalface of trying to bring creativity back into children's lives since then. The importance of place has been critical in that work, and we were lucky in 2015 to be invited by the University of Cambridge, Eddington, what has become the development called Eddington on the north side of Cambridge, to create an education programme, and we called that Artscapers, and that word has gone on to be just a fantastic word to describe this practice that we use, the artists that we're working with use when we're with people. So that's where Artscapers comes from, and that's how I've met Paula, who's going to introduce herself in a minute. But then as a charity working in the region, we realised that working collaboratively, working with others was really how we were going to make a difference. So I was part of coming together with other charities and voluntary sector organisations in 2018 to form ourselves into a consortia called Full Scope. And that's how I met Matt back in 2020, when we were walking through COVID and wondering how we could work together. Artscapers, as I say, has gone on this amazing journey, and it feels a bit like a snowball that's sort of picking up wonderful partnerships and connections and links. Since 2015, over 3,000 children have worked with us, over 500 educators, and just last year we worked in 25 different spaces. And it's really exciting to be here today thinking about more spaces that might like to think about artscaping too.
Brilliant, thank you, Ruth, and we'll hear more about that shortly. Suzanne, I'll hand over to you next.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm one of the artists that started right from the beginning with Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination. And I'm also very privileged to be the first artist who started on the very first sessions of what's Artscapers that started at Eddington. And I've been dipping in and out of that ever since. And I was also part of the branching out research as well at different schools. So it's been a long journey. I think I'm totally passionate about the power of art to change the world, basically, if you work with people in a certain way. And so it's been great journey so far, to be continued.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Suzanne. Lucy, I'll come to you next.
Hi everybody, it's really lovely to be here amongst colleagues. My name's Lucy and I'm a freelance creative producer, and I had the absolute pleasure to meet and work with everybody on the panel when I was hired by Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination and Full Scope to coordinate the delivery element of the project that we're going to hear about today, Branching Out. So I was involved in recruiting and coordinating the project across the 6 partner schools who took part in the pilot.
Thank you, Lucy. Paula, come to you next.
Hi, I'm Paula Ailiff, and until very recently, I was co-head teacher of Mayfield Primary School, which was the first school that, or one of the first schools that took part in Artscapers, and was just so revolutionary to help us with our curriculum, because we took what we learned from Artscapers, what we could see happening with the children as they encountered Artscapers, we took it back into our school, into something we call Out and About. So all of our children have an afternoon out of the classroom every week, whatever the weather, outside learning, doing creative activities. And yeah, I'm shortly to be finishing at school in another 10 days' time. So looking forward to continuing working with CCI in the future.
Thank you very much, Paula. And Matt.
Hi, my name's Matt. Thanks for having me today. I work for an organisation called Cambridge Acorn Project, and we do therapeutic work with children and families across Cambridgeshire who have experienced trauma. And I kind of, as Ruth kind of gestured towards, we kind of met during the middle of COVID, and we're talking around how we could potentially work together, because I was very drawn to CCI's website and some of the amazing projects that were kind of being showcased on there. And one of the things that kind of came out of that conversation, as well as sort of creating it in the first place, was kind of around the idea of how we can address challenges in the mental health system by not just having a reliance on therapy, but how we can look at kind of other approaches, projects, sort of ideas that could be kind of therapeutic in nature, but aren't therapy and shouldn't pretend to be for many reasons. And I think, I mean, we'll talk a little bit, I think, about this later, but it's been an incredibly exciting and inspiring journey for me and for our organisation. And we continue to work with CCI in a number of partner schools. Just started some projects again this week, which has been really nice. And just to echo, I think the journey sort of carries on and has been sort of very exciting to this point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. And I suppose just from my perspective, as I said, I am Executive Director of the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, but have worked with Ruth and CCI now for 7 years, and it has been the most inspirational part of my work for those 7 years in shaping my practice, and really passionate and inspirational in terms of the work that the way that it's shifted my thinking, both in terms of good education, supporting teachers, working across sectors, and hopefully that will come out throughout the next hour or so as I talk a little bit more about our work together. So what I'm going to do now, as I said, is after that introduction, talk a little bit about the research on which the Branching Out project and sort of leads up to some of the research, what we did, but also the findings in particular. It will be quite brief, but hopefully will give you a flavour of some of the things that we found through the research elements of the project. We'll then have more of a panel discussion about some of those experiences from the panel's perspective. And as I say, if you do have any questions at any point, do add them into the Q&A element. You should be able to click on the little button Q&A, and that will send those questions through, and highlight if there's a question you'd like to ask to a specific panel member, because that's also absolutely fine. So I've sort of entitled this Researching the Impact of Arts in Nature Practice on Children's Wellbeing, and there's 2 projects that's worked through, which are Eco-Capabilities and Branching Out. And they've been funded by UKRI, as I said, and done very much in collaboration with originally CCI, but also more recently Full Scope and Cambridge Acorn Project, and also working with colleagues across both UCL and Anglia Ruskin University, particularly Hilary Bungay and Anna Dadswell, who have worked with us most recently on the Branching Out project. So I wanted to just acknowledge their input too. It's important, although the main focus of today is to think about branching out, and I realise there's lots of names here, but it very much started our work with CCI, looking at the impact of CCI's practice through eco-capabilities in terms of thinking about this arts in nature practice, as we called it at the time, artscaping, as now CCI term it, and as you will see in the documentation that has been launched today. And that project, which was a few years ago now, looked at how arts in nature practice both supports children's mental health and well-being, but also affects children's connections with nature. So it has really very much a focus on mental health and well-being, but also that in thinking about sustainability, climate change, education, and how we're looking after ourselves, but also planetary health as well is really important. And that stemmed from a concern with 3 things. So a concern, of course, with mental health and well-being, which of course, where everybody in the virtual room is aware of being increasingly in crisis, and the fact that schools are increasingly expected to support children and young people with their mental health and well-being, but with few resources to do so. And a concern around decreasing connectivity with nature, so children sort of looking at screens, spending more time indoors and being less connected with nature. And also a concern about marginalisation of the arts. So a concern that actually school curricula are moving away from the arts and children are becoming disengaged with or having less opportunity to engage with arts. So through eco-capabilities, we worked with artists through CCI, and we went into schools and the artists undertook 8 full days of artscaping, arts in nature practice, with children aged sort of 7 to 9 within primary school settings over a period of a few months. This was shortly after the COVID lockdown, and they worked really intensively with those children, particularly in schools in areas of high disadvantage, to work through this artscaping, this arts in nature practice. And we undertook as researchers a range of research methods to try and understand the impact of that arts in nature practice on children, particularly children's mental health and well-being. And what we did alongside that is we found that actually the arts in nature practice developed 8 what we call eco-capabilities. These are a little bit like competencies or skills, characteristics that we felt were developed through this practice. Things like autonomy or confidence. The children went out and changed in terms of becoming more confident, particularly those children who were perhaps less confident within the classroom traditionally. I'm not going to read out the full list on the left there. You can see those. The other thing that was really important alongside mental emotional well-being relationships with humans, so the relationships with each other, the children with each other, but also the relationship between the children and the teachers very much changed, and that impacted then the rest of what was happening for the rest of the week through the more traditional learning in those classrooms. And then the relationships with nature as well, so children started to see themselves as being part of nature and started to articulate the fact that they wanted to, because they were part of it, protect it and look after it, and hence the kind of more sustainability element of that as well. And I've got a quote here. There's lots of quotes. I don't have time to show them all today, but there are more quotes in some of the publications, both of the publications actually, that are available online. We'll put links in the chat. But this one, remember, we are nature, so we don't destroy it, we take care of it, exemplifies exactly what I've just said. So children started to see themselves as being part of nature and wanted to look after it. And of course, that gave them that emotional well-being alongside. So we found basically, alongside those 8 eco capabilities, children's wellbeing was improved by the development of things like self-confidence and self-esteem, agency, slowness and calmness, and connectedness with nature. And we also found that children felt happy with their life and were more optimistic about what the future holds for them. So really positive impacts on wellbeing. But of course, one of the things that was a challenge for us was thinking, well, how can we support this practice within more schools? It was absolutely fantastic. Art is absolutely fundamental to this work and the way that artists work within schools with children and young people. But how can we sort of expand that so that we can reach more children and young people with little resource? So we then applied for and received more funding, as I say, this, and you can see the project partners on the right hand side there, for a second project, Branching Out, which is what we're predominantly talking about today, and which the 2 reports are outputs from. So we wanted to think about, and this was tackling mental health inequalities in schools with what we call community artscapers. So what we wanted to do for the 2 aims were explore how CCI and full scope partners can adapt their practice to allow wider impact across more school contexts. So as I said, trying to reach more children and young people by thinking about how more creatively about how we can work with schools. And the model that we came up with through a variety of sort of processes, looking at interviews with artists and teachers from eco capabilities, working with schools through different studies to try and understand their different contexts, their needs and what might work for them, and also working with stakeholder groups, is community artscapers. And what we mean by community artscapers is, and we can talk more about this later on as well, is partly, sometimes that's volunteers, so it's working with volunteers around the school community, just in the same way that there might be volunteers to support reading in schools, or it could be teaching assistants, so working with teaching assistants who and training and supporting those. And we provided training and support through the arts element with CCI, but also the therapy element, which Matt might want to talk about shortly, through Cambridge Acorn Project. So to see what the impact was then on schools, and we piloted this approach with 6 schools. We also wanted to set up sustainable partnerships between schools, local authorities, NHS trusts, and the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, because we are very much aware that actually and believe strongly that leaving looking after the emotional and mental health well-being of children and young people to schools is not enough. We need to work cross-sector, looking at what is the responsibility of the local authorities, how can we work with NHS trusts, and as I say, different sectors to bring them together. So that was the other element of the project. How can we work together across the sector, across the ecosystem, rather than just sort of seeing it and leaving schools to it, if you like. So we ran that, as I say, we undertook a pilot, and as CCI and Cambridge Acorn Project can talk more about that if you'd like, as one of your questions shortly. And we then undertook some work to try and evaluate the impact of that within those schools in the pilot. And these are some of the findings. Again, I'll just talk briefly about them, but you'll be able to find more in the documentation. So we found that the community artscaping model was deemed acceptable and appropriate by over 95% of respondents. So we worked with effectively a Delphi study, a questionnaire, and we sent out nationally to people who are responsible for pastoral wellbeing within schools of children and young people, SENCOs, inclusion leads, etc. And we had responses around the model, and we refined the model through that questionnaire process. And over 95% of respondents found that the model of using community artscapers was acceptable and appropriate. We then undertook interviews with those community artscapers in the schools of the pilots, and we found that it had a positive impact in a similar way to eco capabilities, children's confidence, their relationships with one another, the happiness they felt, their creativity, their engagement as learners. So it affected the way that children went out in small groups, came back to the classroom, and they were more engaged as learners in their well-being. I should have said, actually, the community artscaping model doesn't work with whole classes, which is what we were doing with eco capabilities, but smaller groups of children and young people who were selected either vertically across the school or within parts of classes to go out of lessons at a few children at a time, up to about 10 or 12 children at a time. Again, there's much more information about that in the resources, and we can talk more about that if it would be helpful shortly. The other thing that was really interesting, and perhaps a little bit more unexpected but quite obvious when you think about it, was the impact on the adults as well. So whether that's the teaching assistants or whether they were volunteers, which might include parents, or in fact the teachers who were involved in the project, their confidence also grew, their well-being improved, and they became they got a broader understanding of mental health provision for children. So they talked about the fact that traditionally mental health provision is sort of seen in a very certain way, but actually that they could see a different way that arts in nature practice or artscaping done using this different model, using community artscapers, was another approach to supporting mental health and well-being of children and young people in schools. And I wanted to finish off with just a couple of quotes. Firstly, one from one of our children involved in our project, because I always think they can say things so much more better than me. So they say that the one at the top there says, being in nature, you're free to explore and have fun. You have no limits, which is one of our Year 5 children, which is just fantastic. And you can see that kind of sense of freedom and how that sort of connects them to nature and also provides that well-being. But then the bottom one there from one of our head teachers, it's made me think differently. Mental health support doesn't always have to be something that's gone through referral processes, that relies on external agencies and huge amounts of funding. So starting to think, as I say, differently about the way that we support our children with their mental health and well-being in schools, and think more broadly about the possibilities. And again, I'm sure we'll touch on that again in the discussion over the next few minutes. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's given you a sense of the research. But now what I'm going to do is hand over to my colleagues and to ask them about a particular highlight from their different perspectives, because hopefully you got a sense from their introductions that they all bring different experience and different perspectives to this project. And I'm going to ask them to talk about that particular highlight of the Branching Out project and sort of reflecting on their own experiences, which again might inform how you might take the project forward within your own context if you're in that position. Just a reminder, again, any specific questions or follow-up, do pop them in the chat. So Suzanne, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, to sort of reflect on your highlights of the project and your perspectives. Thank you.
I think I've got about 3 actually. My first one, with the recent work we've been doing, and because we're going to lots of different schools and working with small groups, is that I've realised that an outside space doesn't have to be a meadow, and I want everyone to know that it doesn't have to be a beautiful meadow or a forest. It can be a very small patch. It can be a bland field or a hedgerow, and everywhere's got something growing or crawling or falling. And a horizon and a sky. So already it's a wonderful starting point for children to explore and find things. And also I wanted to talk a little bit about what always enthralls me is that there's a very simple recipe for taking children outside and working with art, making something creative. And we often call the art making, because art's got lots of connotations, as we know. It can be quite challenging for some people. And I was thinking about it as like a recipe. So it's not just that we're making art outside, it's actually a way of techniques. It's about an invitation to come outside with us, a simple prompt to set people off. It's also, I always tell children that there's no way that's supposed to be, that way I don't know what it's going to look like. So therefore they feel free to go off and explore the way they want and make anything they like. The slowing down, we always try and create a space, and that actually the outside space is wonderful for that. Of course, you're in nature, you're listening, you're immersing yourself, and the slowing down is a big part of it, and reflecting. And once people start to immerse, and there's always a collecting, finding, exploring the space they're in. And then there's a burst of creativity, which could be quite quiet. People work in groups, or sometimes they work on their own. sometimes when they're working, it's not always like a beginning, a middle and an end. Sometimes there's just a middle, and sometimes it's just a beginning and no end. So the work that we really value and that seems to work for children making art is that they don't have to come up with an object or something at the end. They often do, but often it's not finished. And the important thing is sometimes I have worked with some children. It was a real highlight. I remember a child working with graphite and an oil pastel, and she spent the whole session just exploring how those two materials worked with each other. So all the other children had something to show at the end. So one of the teachers and the volunteer would go, well, yes. And I said, actually, this child. So it's really important to notice the process and how some people are making art, exploring art and creating things. And the other thing I just wanted to say was that sort of a new thing I've realized over the last year or two working is that when we start to create this environment for children to make, that they've all started to talk. They start to trust the adults. They start to trust the teachers more, I feel, and they start to trust me and each other. And so as time's going on, we're working in some challenging schools. There's often quite a lot of conversations that come up that I think wouldn't have come up without the art being there. The art is like the kind of third person for me. So they get to make art and then they start to say things and talk about things that are troubling them or challenging them. Other children respond. There's a lot of generosity. And as you said, relationships with adults. And I just wanted to talk about the creation. I was lucky enough to work at Mayfield with 2 groups of children to co-create some resources for other people to use and benefit from. And this is with Lucy. We had a couple of sessions with some children from Mayfield School. And they got to be artscapers again, and they're beautiful. They do have a lovely little meadow there, don't they, Paula? And we asked, they got to create, they had a little exhibition at the end and sharing, and we asked them some questions about how they would like adults to be when they're working with them. And their responses became, with all of us, the companionship, I don't know if you can see a companionship compass that has different ways of working. Actually make a little compass. You've seen the film on CCI website, that's there. And we also created a guide, which is very practical. That's also available on the CCI website, a guide about how to get started. If you're a teacher or you're a student or you're an artist or want to start, or you're some sort of therapist that wants to work with their teacher. So it's some very good practical, and it's got lots of beautiful quotes from children on there too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Suzanne. I'm going to ask the same question to Lucy next. That's okay. So what was a highlight from your perspective?
Thanks, Nicola. It's really lovely to hear Suzanne talk, because it just reminds me of so many nice moments from the project. I'm going to focus on the importance for the project of professional development. So we ran a full day training day for teachers, teaching assistants and volunteers at Mayfield Primary School to kickstart the project. And then we delivered care and support sessions where both Matt and Suzanne were available on Zoom calls it was almost like a little clinic, I'd say, like a creative clinic, creative therapeutic clinic, where individuals could come and say, this is what happened, and share things that were going well, sharing any barriers that they'd come up against. And it was just a really nice opportunity to have a space to discuss how the project was going. And I think for me, it's something I knew already, but this again demonstrated for me that there is a real limitation in the primary PGCE and also in training opportunities for creative practice. I think in the primary PGCE, maybe they get 1 day or half day talking about the art curriculum, which is really challenging then to think about how you might deliver that curriculum and think about creativity. It was such a joy to have teaching assistants involved in this. They hold so much skills in schools, both in terms of the work that they often do one-to-one with children, but also they're often very much part of a community. They know their community, they care for their community. And so being able to have a real mix of skill sets within that space for training was invaluable. And I think what really came out of that training session was teachers and teaching assistants sometimes frustration of how the art curriculum or creativity was thought or considered within the school settings. One of the teachers described his frustration at what he called conveyor belt art, where you have a session which is about, say, Picasso, and then everyone makes a Picasso and then we rate which is the best Picasso. Whereas it seemed there was a real freeing of the idea of how we actually frame creativity and how we think about providing the framework, prompts and space for there to be no preconceived outcomes, and exactly how Suzanne was talking about just before, how we create a space for children to be able to follow a lead and to be explorers and to experiment. I think this gave teachers a real confidence to be able to position themselves more as companions or facilitators, rather than feeling like they needed to have a beginning, middle, and an end, being confident in holding that space. I also think because the training was delivered with Matt, there was a real confidence in teachers understanding that they don't have to become therapists in order to create a therapeutic space for children. So Matt will probably talk more about this potentially, but I think it gave teachers a real importance to understand their roles as safe adults and how they can create a therapeutic space, and that came out through the training. I think it was really important that we held those training sessions cross schools, because it gave an opportunity to consider similarities and differences in terms of what setup schools had in place. For some schools to say, oh yeah, well, we've got this part of our school which wasn't used and we've turned it into this. There was a skill sharing element to the session, and a chance for teachers to reflect both individually and collectively on their practice, and to feel part of a network. I think they were really, really key things that came out of us having this professional development approach. And it also supported schools to get involved in the first place, because I think there are limited opportunities for good, high quality, creative professional development. So I think to sum up, there was a real broader understanding of what therapeutic spaces could look like, and what creativity could be within a school environment, moving away from performance based kind of selection processes and what achievement looks like, to valuing process, and there being really key opportunities for us to learn and celebrate each other, and that everyone within that space brought different skills. And I'll stop talking there, Nicola.
Thank you. You can get us a sense, everybody, of how, because we're all so passionate about it and can see the difference, it's very hard to not to talk a lot about it. But, thank you for the questions coming up. We will come on to the questions next, but I'm going to ask Paula to come in next, because Lucy started to touch on some of that professional development and the impact on teachers. What would you say that you would like to add in terms of your own highlight from your perspective as a head teacher?
So having taken the principles of Artscapers and implemented it as part of our curriculum offer, which is a non-negotiable, I'm just going to share some quotes from children, some quotes from adults to really impact what was already been said, really, and reiterate that. So I've got some quotes here from different children in our school. They say that Artscapers allows them to be free, to have space, to have time. They like the fact that there are no walls. The classroom walls have gone if we're outside. There's thinking space, and that has an implication on their writing. So they're writing, one child, my writing has been unleashed. I'm not constricted anymore. And no one is looking over my shoulder, said another child. I'm not restricted. So that has a huge implications to what our current curriculum looks like and what the implications of that are. The adults who take part, these are both teachers and teaching assistants. One teacher said, the children have showed me that I always overplan my lessons. I have preconceived ideas about what the children are able to do. I underestimate their ability to imagine and to be creative. I need to have less structure. I need to allow them to flourish. I need to work alongside the children when we're outside, not in front of them. And I need to try and do that in the classroom as well. So those are sort of some perspectives from children's perspective, from particular adult teacher who has been in education for over 20 years. And this is new learning for them. And even though we have this approach to our curriculum, even though we have this offer for our children, we have had a huge increase in mental health queries from parents and highly anxious children, even though we're in a school that it is hopefully less pressurized than some others. We still are seeing children that are more anxious than ever. And the thing that they're articulating and worried about at the moment is the PAC curriculum. As they move from primary to secondary, they know and fear this PAC curriculum. And they have this huge, overwhelming sense that they are going to fail because there is no way that they feel that they can keep up. But by giving them this opportunity to be outside, be creative, they're now able to at least articulate that when before they might not have done. So, yeah, that's what I want to share with you today.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for bringing the voices of the children to us. And we would normally actually have voices of children within these sorts of sessions. Please do access online. We'll put links, some of the videos that we have, which will predominantly involve children's voices on there as well. Ruth, I'm going to come to you next in terms of your thoughts in terms of the highlights.
Thanks, Nicola. There were so many. Everyone's had so many. Now I'm scribbling away. I'd written one very dutifully down, but now I've got about 15. Paula's comment then about children feeling anxious. Paula and I met through the Learning Without Limits network a long time ago, and they are very influenced by the work of Reggio. And Reggio talk about that one of the purposes of the work that happens in Reggio is they use the metaphor if they're giving children an extra pocket. And I love that metaphor because it's like there's something, we're tucking something onto, we're helping children have something that they can just draw on that's like a strength. And I hope that, like Paul is saying, that it's awful to think of children going up into secondary school with this dread. And what I love about Artscaping is that maybe it's just giving them something that they can draw on and know that that's a place that they can go to. It's a practice they've absorbed. It's time when they've had that slowing down, listening, that quality of relationship, all the things that Lucy and Suzanne and so on have talked about and Paula have talked about. The highlights for me, in particular, our CCI's reporting year ends in July. So I was doing our reporting year and doing all the kind of numbers and things and talking about what had happened. And one of the things I could talk about that had happened was that 50 workshops were run by community artscapers. 50 opportunities were run by community artscapers. And that's a real sense of the practice spreading, of children having these opportunities who we didn't know about. And when you and I were planning this, branching out and thinking about, would this work? Could we share the practice in this way? And I think that's been that was a really wonderful moment to see that. And Suzanne mentioned the compass. My compass sits by me on my desk. I really, it's rooted me and held me and reminded me of so many things, and I think that's for me that's a real highlight out of this. And finally, Suzanne and Lucy both touched on it, but I think we've always said that Artscaping, CCI has always said we could work with people in a car park, it doesn't matter where we are. And I think some of the schools were nervous about signing on to the programme because they weren't sure that they had the right kind of nature spaces or the right access to nature. And I think what we've learned through this and shown through this is, as Suzanne says, it is just come out and have the sky over your head and you will find something somewhere that is alive and that can nourish this way of being. And I think that's a really important reminder. You and I, Nicola, sometimes have had this, well, what would that look like in a rural school, or what would that look like in an urban school? And I think those distinctions can be over worried about in this context when this is about a way of being. And if you take that way of being, it works regardless of whether you can get into a nature reserve or whether you're just having to work with the scruffy end of a playground, because there's wonder to be found. So those are my highlights. Sorry, I got 3 in, but I couldn't resist.
That's fine. I'll let you off. So Matt, I'm going to come to you next, because if in some ways you come from with quite a different perspective and joining Branching Out, having not been part of Eco Capabilities, I'd really be interested to hear about your journey and a particular highlight from you.
It's really difficult because there has literally been so many. And I should also apologize. My computer suddenly decided that it wants to sound like it's about to take off. So I hope you can, it might be a good thing if it drowns out my voice, but I hope you can sort of still hear me. I think like if I sort of focus on something that sort of describes the journey, I remember sort of hearing it was a year 5 child talk about the concept of freedom. And it kind of came up in your last slide, Nicola, and also very much in sort of what Paula was sharing about the sort of being outside and there being no walls. And I think, first of all, it's quite profound to hear children of that age talking about quite a complex concept like that and able to apply it to an activity like artscaping. And I think it was a nice reminder of kind of how, when children are given the opportunity, like they can come up with the most extraordinary things, and we underestimate how much that they can understand and articulate about the world that we live in. And I think that, I mean, it wasn't just that, but I think that was sort of the embodiment of something that has led to a lot more thinking about some of the wider themes that I think in your other quote from the head teacher, Nicola, picked up on about the mental health system and about how we're responding to children, how we are potentially medicalizing them, how there's an over-reliance on counselling. And I think one of the things that it's got me kind of thinking about and particularly inspired by is the synergy between artscaping and therapeutic work. And I think a lot of it kind of boils down to that word, freedom. And a colleague of mine is doing some internal research for one of our projects at the moment, has been talking to some children about what they feel has been beneficial about therapy, and if they've been able to articulate that. And some of the stuff has again been really profound, but a lot of them have focused on that concept of, actually, this is a space that I'm in control of. And I think that when you start unpicking that further, you start thinking about who is the right person to have a conversation with a child about something awful that may have happened. And I noticed someone put something in the chat about trauma. And making sure that children remain in the lead of that process. I think it begins to show that actually there are ways and means of doing this that are outside of the therapy room, and actually that we can start to not just recognize that, but articulate it on quite a deep level. And because I think sometimes the mental health system itself doesn't speak that language, and perhaps doesn't understand how powerful different and alternative ways of approaching this can be. And that has led in itself to, like, I mean, we're sort of currently working on the development of a sort of training day, perhaps even a training program about how spaces, intervention, maybe that's the wrong word, projects, different, resources in the community, whether that's youth clubs, scout groups, schools, so many different kind of environments could be more therapeutic and potentially kind of have those kind of conversations. And I remember the first ever artscaping session that I went to in a school, I walked to the back, and one of the first things I saw was the artist had created what I can't remember what it was called. It was like a lost tree, and all the children had written kind of messages to loved ones who were no longer around. And that's what if that was the result of a therapeutic intervention, you would be absolutely delighted if a child had felt safe to open up about those things. So I think that what I've learned is this is a really magical and very, very powerful activity that we can do so much more with. And I'm just super excited about the next step of the journey. I mean, I could talk about many other things, but I think in terms of like what's been shared already and my journey and our journey as an organization, that I think has been very kind of profound for us.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I think for me, that starts to hint at some of the complexities of working sort of across different sectors, and the fact that you sort of mentioned the word intervention, which is really interesting, because of course we would, and CCI would talk so much about these experiences as being entitlements for all children, you know, Paula would talk about this as being something that is an entitlement for all of her children in her school every, you know, half a day a week, every week. And that is, of course, I think what we would all aspire to here. But when we work with our colleagues in NHS trusts and various different sectors, then we need to reframe that in terms of interventions. So trying, for me, a really interesting piece of learning has been bringing together stakeholders. As I said, that was one of the things we did through the project, from these different often quite disparate settings or contexts, to try to work together to support children's mental health and well-being. And navigating those boundaries of potential boundaries of language has been really interesting, but overcoming that to make sure that we are working together rather than in kind of segments or is really, really important, and it's definitely a work in progress. Thank you so much. Now we've got some fantastic questions which I'm going to try to navigate through, both in the Q&A and also in the open chat. So I'll try and sort of bring them together and focus them on specific people if they've been sort of
Oh, Nicola's frozen for me. Is she frozen for everybody
Yeah, I
else?
think we seem to have lost Nicola.
Okay. Why don't we start with, there's a question here for Paula. Should we just go straight in while we wait for Nicola to catch up? Paula, did you see the question about, my question is for Paula. My placement is an area of higher deprivation and seems to be incredibly busy fitting in the curriculum. How were you persuaded to make the time and see the importance of Artscapers? That's from Rosa. And it was, she asked it for you, if you don't mind, Paula.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm asked this question a lot by head teachers all over the country, actually, and my response is actually, well, having been through and seeing the benefits that the children have, I have to turn the question around and say that actually you can't afford not to do it, because what we're having is that space, that 2 hours a week where they're outside doing these Artscapers activities, enables them to achieve more highly. I mean, I haven't got categoric research, imperial research to back that up, but the children are more able more quickly to settle to the work that they are set. And so I think it is a much more efficient use of time. Having that time out of the classroom then has benefits when it's brought back in, because the children are in a better mental state to actually confront some of those challenges that a curriculum demands. So I've said that to head teachers. Most of them just aren't brave enough to see that. They just can't quite believe that those 2 hours spent in a different way would be more beneficial. Extra fluency sessions, extra time practicing timetables, whatever it might be. It's just, those quotes that I gave you from those children, and actually if you look on the website and listen to some of the children from my school, they talk about this. They talk about the benefits of being outside and then helping them to be more effective, more efficient learners when they're back in the classroom.
Thank you,
So I don't know if
Paula.
that
That's
answers the
really
question.
helpful. It does, and I think that's what we found. If one of the online resources on the CCI website, 2 of the teachers from Eco Capabilities talk about the impact on them and the children, and how that feeds through into the rest of the week, which is exactly what you're saying, isn't it, Paula? In terms of, it's not just mental health and well-being or in those 2 hours. The benefits sort of permeate across the whole of the rest of the week, both in terms of their mental health and well-being, but also their learning. It makes the rest of the learning so much more productive. And I remember asking some teachers during Eco Capabilities where they were spending a day a week kind of for a couple of months doing Artscaping, sort of how are you finding the rest of the week, particularly given the concern around sort of squeeze curriculum. And they said, oh, well, it's quite busy. And then they sort of reflected, but it's always quite busy. It makes no difference. It was quite busy before, but it's just different. And as I say, they could really see the value of the impact it was having on the children, particular groups of children throughout the rest of the week. And I'll use that as a way of moving into the sort of next set of questions, which are really around which children, we've got a question, which children benefit most, how you selected the children. I know that in Paula's school, all children do it, but through the Community Artscapers project of branching out, we had groups of children coming out. And I don't know whether someone can say a little bit more. Lucy, perhaps if you could say a bit more about how children were selected and how that process, and then perhaps somebody else can reflect on which groups they feel might be most impacted. I would argue all of them. But anyway, over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, it was very much a collaboration with each individual school. We worked with a range of different schools, some which were very large primary schools, some which were, one form entry, very small rural primary schools. So we really wanted to work with the context of where those schools were coming from and what would benefit them. And quite a few schools used the opportunity to select children which they classified, this is their terminology, not ours, as hidden. And these were children who weren't necessarily the highest achievers, but weren't necessarily the ones that they were really worried about. But within a class of 30, children who sometimes were very quiet and just weren't necessarily seen. And this was an opportunity where lots of teaching staff felt that they had the opportunity to be seen, to develop confidence, and they saw a real change in some of the children's behaviour when they went back into their classroom. We had one school where the selection was a little bit more challenging. I think they'd handed over, we worked a lot with pastoral teams and those who were looking after well-being for the whole school, who were involved in the decision making. In one particular school, it was given to a lot of the teachers as a decision, and that ended up being quite a challenging group, because I think they were thinking that this is an opportunity for children who really struggle in a full class. And in that particular group, there were lots of ranging needs. Some children who needed really quiet spaces, others needed very noisy spaces. So we did spend that took a little bit of time to get that group to gel. So yeah, I think really what worked well was teachers and pastoral teams being involved in the selection process. I don't know if I've slightly missed the question, Nicola. I missed a second half.
No, not at all. That's really helpful. It tended to be, as you've said, the hidden or the invisible children, as you've articulated, but children that were just below the threshold for sort of more formal support that Matt was kind of referring to earlier. So which of course is more and more in terms of that group of children, because the formal services are so stretched. So no, that's very helpful. I mean, would somebody else on the panel? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I think one of the things, thinking about the pastoral teams at the schools where CCI and Cambridge Acorn Project run nurture group work, which isn't necessarily the branching out schools, but I suppose listening to those colleagues talk about which children they feel benefit most. It's often they are selecting the children who haven't yet formed friendships. They just haven't got time and this is a secondary school as well, and I think that picks up on Paula's point about the packed curriculum. They hadn't had time to find friendships, and that the artscaping moments gives them a space to form some friendships, find some people that they can take that friendship back into the rest of the school day. So I think there is something around giving children a chance to find companions, and also to be seen more companionably by the adults is really important.
Thank you, Ruth. You've just mentioned secondary school, and Matt, if I'm going to come to you with again a sort of related question about the age of children or a young person that this would suit. So Dima's asked a question about whether this would suit older children, for example, age 15, particularly those who have suffered trauma or difficulties or are neurodivergent. Sort of, Matt, from your perspective, how would this sort of practice at Artscaping, even though of course our work was in primary school, Ruth said that CCI worked with secondary schools as well. From your perspective, Matt, would that, how would that work with sort of older children and young people?
I mean, I don't see any kind of explicit. It's not like in my experience of it, it's not like a got to stop using that word. It's not a project that's kind of built for younger children specifically. And I think that it's, I mean, we work in a kind of, yeah, quite a high need secondary school with CCI, and I think we've seen really amazing levels of engagement from sort of older young people, and that there's no reason, I think, why inherently it couldn't be used. The principles are, I think, are exactly the same. I mean, Suzanne and Ruth can probably speak to that more than I could. I think in terms of trauma, it's a very naturally beautiful intervention, to be honest, because it has many of the kind of elements of kind of recovery from trauma that people kind of speak about, and that are in the literature, even if they're obviously not in the kind of clinical studies, and it takes that very kind of holistic approach. But there's so many kind of elements about being in the outdoors and mindfulness and breathing and just sense of peace and calm and safety. And I think one of the other things sort of I've noticed about that as well is it being in a world which is defined by those concepts enables you to talk about them in a different way, and I think that's immensely powerful in itself. In terms of neurodivergence, I think we had a very interesting conversation about that cohort of children that Lucy referred to, and how actually perhaps some different thinking could go on in terms of maybe some more specific things that could be done in outdoor spaces that would meet the needs of those children in a slightly different way. And it's quite relevant to a piece of work that sort of happened this week as well. So I think that's something that we're kind of actively thinking about some more. But again, there's quite a crossover, I think, between, for example, trauma, attachment difficulties, and sort of children that are potentially sort of on the autism spectrum, around things like safe space and being able to have somewhere that you can go that feels safe and calm, and that sort of fulfills those kind of needs. So I think there's a huge crossover, and I think that it is a very naturally inclusive intervention. So it would work well across the age groups, but also around children, young people who do come at it with kind of different perspectives and different personalities.
Thank you, Matt. Suzanne, would you like to come in and say anything from your perspective and experience of working with children of different age groups and different backgrounds?
Actually, I was just going to say I've just been working at a secondary school, and it does work slightly differently to working in a primary school, and that these children they're also supposed to be the sort of invisible children. But in fact, I think one of the reasons they're sort of invisible is they've all got quite different kind of challenges they're facing. And I always felt that when they came out, it was like a relief to get out. We've been working very far away on the absolute opposite end of the field from their school. And even the teacher, when she came out, she would say, "Thank God I've managed to get out of the school." And the school is like a very stressful place. And I think what it's been offering the children there is a place to be playful, silly, juvenile, and not to be watched or noticed by some of their peer group who may well be, that they may feel they've just there's one group that's just come up from primary school. We worked with them when they were at primary school as well, and now it's a transition project, and so it's some children from two different year groups. And I didn't really know that was happening until we went back early one afternoon into the school environment again, from being outside and having made some wonderful creation together. And as they went into the school, they actually kind of bristled, and they all changed character as soon as they came into the school environment. They sat in a kind of quad. They wouldn't communicate with us anymore properly. They just said, "Can we go now?" They were just so embarrassed. And so it really made me feel, okay, working. But when they're out with us, after a few weeks, they came to trust us. They're talking to us about a lot of things going on for them. And I could see that this outside space was like a little oasis then in a very complex.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suzanne. So we focused a little bit.
Do you want to? You had your hand up, Paula.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Paula.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say that for us, it has genuinely benefited all the children, whatever their needs, because it allows the adults to see the children in a different light, and allows the children to express themselves in a different way. And So those children who actually do well within the classroom then go outside and have those classroom walls taken away. They react sometimes in a very negative way. They can't cope out there without the support of the classroom. So that allowed the adults to notice that. So when they are not therefore in a classroom as they grow up, you know, some of them haven't coped very well because actually the structure of the classroom is what they need. But when you remove that structure, they flounder. So actually, we wouldn't have known that had we not put them in this situation of being outside and having to be creative and use their imagination because they didn't know how to find it.
Thank you, Paula. That's a really interesting point. So we've sort of had some questions about the children. There's also some questions about sort of getting started, sort of working with the volunteers, how much training was undertaken. So if we sort of pick up on that thread and sort of try and address all of them together, I suppose if the question, how do I get started? How do I sort of find some community artscapers? What would I do? I think that's a really important one, particularly for folk on this call. What would you say? I mean, and again, I don't know whether this is Paula might have something, Lucy might have something, all of you. How would you say to get started? What would you recommend? Lucy, do you want to go first, and then we'll go ask Paula?
Yeah, sure. I would say that where the project worked best, and we were really lucky with our partner schools, is that there needs to be a kind of universal understanding and championing of this practice and how it can be implemented and who's going to lead on the work. That was really, really important. And then I think going out to your spaces, because you know, we've worked with schools before, Suzanne. I'm thinking of that secondary school where they were saying, you know, we don't have too many wild spaces, and then beyond their big field was this wood, you know, sort of lining the end, and none of them really knew about this space. And we've worked in quite a few schools. One of the primary schools is quite a new school, part of a new academy, and the head teacher there nearly didn't take part in the project because, you know, there weren't lots of developed trees, but that really didn't matter. And actually that project, it was a practice like artscaping was so beneficial because I'm just looking, there was a thing about the chat about children living in urban settings. You know, one of the children saw their first squirrel while being outdoors, and there was a real excitement for a school that didn't necessarily get outside a lot to be outside in lots of different weathers. So I think the beginning things would be about, how does this work within your implementation plans? How does this work championed? How does everyone understand the benefits, and everyone is kind of included in that conversation? And then mapping your assets and really understanding what green spaces you have access to. Beyond your school, are there spaces that you might be able to have access to? So being creative about your place and your environment. And I'm sure lots of other people have got other things they can
add, and I think the children are the wisest people to ask in that, you know, don't map it on your own, involve the children, because they will have a fantastic perspective on, you know, some of that one of the schools, Lucy, where Hilary, the artist involved, it was making huge maps around the playground spaces and getting the children to put on there the places and the stories and the things that, and the teachers were just amazed. They were like, well, I didn't know about that, and I didn't know about that story. And it was just, there was so much bubbling up. So the children have got to be involved with asking, you know, involve them in where they might like to spend time, or, you know, invite them to show you places that you might not have seen.
And also, I was going to just say, I was just going to say, instead of maybe sometimes thinking about nature, if you feel you are in a very urban environment, just to maybe think about outside, the difference between the inside and the outside. You know, there's a lot outside without having to...
There's the sky.
Yes.
Yeah. And horizons, sky and horizons.
Yes. Exactly, and a weed coming up through the work of CCR, and you will get a sense if you go on the website, it's very much about embodied learning, being and senses, and as I say, it's not just finding large areas of green space with lots of trees. It looks at, and there's a question in the chat about nature and how we're defining nature, and it is in its broadest sense. It is being outdoors, but looking up at seeing the clouds, listening, smelling, almost tasting, not eating, but obviously tasting in your mouth, so that it's almost every sense, and sort of in many different ways. There's lots and lots of different things. I won't start to describe the practice anymore, but yeah, it's really important that isn't seen as a barrier, because it's completely inclusive in the way that it's defining nature. And Paula, I was going to come to you next in terms of thinking about how to get started, how to involve volunteers. What would you suggest in terms of how to get started if you wanted to tomorrow?
Well, first of all, I think schools need to be open to volunteers coming into them, because actually a lot of schools now are closed to external people coming in for safeguarding reasons. So you need to almost break through that barrier, and start to have volunteers, coming into reading, or I mean, I don't know how it would work necessarily in a secondary context in that regard, but you need to have confidence that you can actually recruit volunteers, that they know what they're going to be doing, that they have following safeguarding procedures, and that you have a standard way of including them. So, we go through DBS checks, obviously, and they have to have two references. They have to do a short course that involves child protection training and all of that. So first thing is you have to be confident that you can actually welcome volunteers safely into your school and build that trust with them. So that's almost, needs to be done first before you can contemplate these sorts of things. I mean, we tried it with trialing with a couple of classes first, and proving to ourselves that Artscaping, we could do it in a way that was different to CCI, but relevant to our context and what was most needed by what we wanted the outcomes to perhaps look like. And even then we're surprised by what we found. So lots of little ways, and then bringing it all together when staff have got confident with it, when their own, the idea of a class going outside without any walls is terrifying to a young teacher or an experienced teacher. So they have to do it. They have to be confident to do that themselves first. And then alongside that, the school itself needs to be open to volunteers coming into school and being confident with all of the checks that need to happen. And then you can then go forward from that point. So there's a lot of groundwork needs to happen in the mind as well as the practical things first.
Thank you, Paula. And I suppose that's one thing that's quite important in different schools that we worked with to undertake the pilot, if you like, approached it in different ways. So some used entirely volunteers because they worked more closely with volunteers. Usually they found it easier to get volunteers. Some found it really difficult to get volunteers, and so just use teaching assistants and internal staff, and others were somewhere in the middle. So it's flexible depending on your school's sort of culture and policies and ways of working, and of course can start with just teaching assistants and sort of move, and it can evolve and develop, but it can be adapted to different school contexts, not just in kind of the setting and the space, but also in terms of the children, the needs of how you might define those groups, but also teachers. I suppose the really important thing is trying not to have just one person responsible for it, but working together so that people can support each other, just as we've heard about having those networks. School networks were also really helpful. I'm aware of time, and there's one more question I just want to address, sort of links into sort of that, and I will answer it myself quickly, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. There's a question from Kay, which is really interesting, about kind of negative perceptions of being outside and children not enjoying being outside, and I want to reflect on something which I found really interesting from Eco Capabilities, and we worked in schools, again, which the whole range of backgrounds and perspectives in terms of the children's experiences of nature previously, and the teachers, which is links to what Paula just said. And in the first week, it was really, we had sort of the first aid kit was out almost for the entire session, because the children would come and they'd sort of got stung by a stinging nettle, or they'd got a bit of a scratch by a bramble, and they'd all be stressed, and it would be quite, being outside was quite difficult for these children in a context with, and this was just after the COVID lockdowns as well, and the teachers were quite stressed, just as Paula just described, because they weren't necessarily used to it. But by the end, it was just so fascinating. They were the same scratches or stings or the same environment, but the first aid kit was, you know, tucked away in a bag, and not, the children were just much more freer and at ease with being in that environment, and they'd connected to it in a very different way. And of course, it took time. It was, you know, that it wasn't just the first session and they'd changed, but children started to become more confident and see how they could interact with those outdoor spaces as the weeks went on, and so did the teachers. They became more comfortable. Yes, of course, it was still safe. They still had the risk assessments and all of that, but they became more comfortable with the sort of the fact that the children would be safe outside. So it was the same environment, and the same things were happening, but their responses, both the teachers and the children, to that environment really changed over those weeks as they became useful. Lucy, did you want to come in? I'm not sure if you...
I'm just nodding vigorously because it really chimes with the experience that anecdotally the conversations I had with teaching staff about their experiences, and them realizing that their headspace was completely different after having a session outdoors. But in the particular group that I was mentioning, where it was quite a challenging dynamic, I remember there being one particular girl who didn't want to sit anywhere outside because she just didn't want to sit outside. And then I remember going back to the school for a related project and seeing her sat down on the floor and just thinking like, wow, it just made me realize that you know there are so many barriers in terms of cultural, social, when it comes to green spaces. Who are green spaces for? And if we can actually do that groundwork at school to say that the natural world is for everybody should have access, if we can do that within a school setting, what does that then open up for those children and young people in terms of them feeling like they can hold a place and have a place to the outside worlds beyond their communities? That felt like it's a very small thing, but it's a very powerful thing.
And I just to add, and I think all of those examples that everyone's talking about is why it isn't a one-off. Artscaping isn't your Friday afternoon golden time at the end of term. It is, I mean, what we are, you know, our vision is that every child growing up in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough should be an artscaper every week throughout their school journey. You know, I think it's something that actually, because you do get peaks and troughs and you do go through bumps in the road and you do have to overcome, as Lucy and everyone has highlighted, you know, it takes time and practice, and it needs to be embedded into children's lives. It's not a one-off.
Brilliant, thank you. And on that note, I think we've come to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask the panel, and this is going to be tricky, to think of one word in terms of how you're feeling now, having explored some of the project and reflected on all of the things that hopefully everyone will agree we've achieved. But also, I'd like to invite colleagues who are listening in the room. I'm so sorry we can't see you all, but add words, thoughts, reflections into the chat as well, if you would feel comfortable doing so, even if it's just one word, just in response. Before I come to you, panel, with your one word, which will be the final thing, and I know it'd be tricky, just to remind everybody that Reese put the links into the chat of the Artscaping guide, which is a sort of more practical guide. The research findings behind that is a separate document, if that's helpful for you working with your schools to sort of argue the case for artscaping work. There's also a webinar on the website which gives a sort of summary of the work, which will have a sort of a whole range of voices in there. And as Suzanne's talked about, a whole range of resources, for example, the compass, companionship, and various other things that you might like to use as starting points for your own journeys with artscaping in schools. So on that note, I'm going to go around in a circle, and Ruth, that means you're first with your one word before we finish.
Who suggested one word? That's ridiculous.
Well, it wasn't me, it was you. It was you, I think.
I absolutely know it was me. I can't do one word. I feel like we've opened the window and there's a breeze of new ideas and energy. There you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. Matt.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I can't do one word either. I think I feel like an aeroplane. I'm going to leave that there.
Wow. Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, I'm going to do what Paula did, and I'm going to read out a quote from one of the children.
Okay.
Stand still, breathe in. Where have you arrived?
Thank you, Suzanne. Lucy, you're next.
Mine's just more of a commentary that you can tell that we're a group that don't like to stick to the rules and are always trying to find another way to do a task. So I think the biggest joy with this project has been about, you know, opening up new doors to new ways of thinking.
Thank you, Lucy. You're absolutely right. And Paula, your last
Opportunity. Opportunity.
Well done, Paula.
That's brilliant. And I think that is a fantastic place to end. Thank you so much to panelists for being involved in this webinar. It's really been great to reflect on what has been a brilliant project, brilliant to work with you. And thank you, colleagues and participants, for listening. And I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to hear from you in this webinar, but we very much hope to stay in touch. So please do use the links in the chat, and there are ways to keep in touch on newsletters and directly with us via email addresses on there as well. So thank you so much. Good luck with your own artscaping journeys, and do let us know how it goes. Goodbye.